Hi there, I'm Charles Kasumba, Communications Specialist at Southern Voice, and welcome to the last episode of The Compass. This episode was shot on the heels of our conference in Sao Paulo, Brazil in October 2025. At a time of uncertainty for the next T20 presidency, our guests reflect on the lessons they've learned through the multilateral system and share their vision for a more balanced global system.
Luciana Servo. I'm currently the president of the Institute for Applied Economic Research, which is a government-led think tank linked to the Ministry of Budget and Planning. And I work in the institutions for 27 years. We work for a lot of topics, including the ones that are being discussed in the Southern Voice and others.
Hello, colleagues. Thank you for inviting me to have this conversation. It's very timeless, very timely, and absolutely necessary and crucial. My name is Mikatekiso Kubayi from the Institute for Global Dialogue associated with the University of South Africa. I'm a senior researcher there, responsible for multilaterals for the Institute for Global Dialogue. We are co-conveners this year of the T20 South Africa, and I lead IGD's work, in the T20. Essentially, been doing that for the past 3 years. So this is a major important conversation to have, especially considering that we won't have it, for another more than 16 years to come. So yeah.
Well, Mika, we hear a dialogue about T20 and the T20 process. How did you think is your role as a coordinator, a leader of the T20 South Africa, in this process of bringing the narratives to the global policies and to the leaders?
Yeah, it's a very important question because one of the best things that I think the Global South, presidencies of the G20, successive ones, all four, Indonesia, India, Brazil, and then now South Africa, is, the will to actually build, on what, each, presidency, is actually done. And South Africa made it very clear from the onset, that it was to build on the success of Brazil, a G20, process. So when we set up, the T20, as well, we said, okay, fine. This is where Brazil, moved, the levers, and this is where we want to take it, from there. Brazil made, opened up, the value of societal engagement, with, the G20 process, essentially making it, less of an elitist, process, but more engaging, more inclusive. And we wanted to highlight that because for the Global South, issues of inclusivity have always been, a major commanding issue. The Global South has been excluded, in many fora. In multilateralism, it's been excluded in many, spaces of global governance and, spaces where global solidarity is supposed to, be the order of the day. Global South was not included in the design, of the global governance system, the global financial architecture, and so on and so forth. So we've been trying to, rather do so. So it helps, it helps to get the message out there, the narrative out there, on what it is, that is important for the Global South, to actually achieve.
And I would pick from what you said and say that I think this construction of four subsequent Global South president for the G20 makes a lot of difference. In the sense that we came from Indonesia during the COVID and was quite challenging for them. But even though it was challenged, they put a process of dialogue, virtual dialogues, that built some topics for the agenda, bringing the Southern topics to the center of the agenda. Inequality, underdevelopment, debt, discussion about poverty, a lot of topics that were not part of the G20 agenda. And then we came to India, that started this process of inclusion of society, because they brought the process for all the schools, all the universities in the country, huge participation in the process. I remember when I arrived in India for the first time, we gave autographs for the people as T20. And I think it was quite interesting. What we're doing here, giving autographs, but they know that something was happening.
Yeah.
And then when we came to Brazil, there was this idea of the G20 social from the government that is bringing the engagement groups, but also other parts of the society. But for us as T20, there was another question in Brazil. Most of the country didn't know about G20.
Yeah.
Most of the country didn't know of the value of T20 for the process. So one of the things that was quite important for us is to bring more national think tanks, not the traditional ones like Ipea, FUNAG, Fundação Getúlio Vargas, to the debate.
Yeah.
Then you have this council, the National Council of Think Tanks, to support the process of the participation of national think tanks, young youth-led think tanks, other think tanks that was working with the topics, but also international council that has the representative of all the countries of the G20. Because I think to establish a dialogue, it's fundamental to have not only representativeness, but a space for dialogue.
Yeah.
And that's something that I think was a lesson for the software voice process from Indonesia to Brazil, and then for South Africa. Then South Africa did something that we didn't lack. That was, how do you go for a more implementation-oriented agenda? We are much in the recommendation process for the leaders. We did it well. But the implementation part of the agenda, the effectiveness of the agenda of think tanks from the southern countries, it was good, but it was not enough. And I think that you did a great job on bringing this effectiveness of the process, more focus-oriented, and thinking that that's less presence of the global south.
Now, one of the challenges, is precisely that many people simply don't know what the T20 actually is, or what it does, or that it even exists. And I encountered this. I mean, I had a conversation with one gentleman, a senior economist, at a leading, a development bank, in South Africa. And he said, but I've never heard of this thing. What is this? And mind you, I had emailed him, right? The all three, sessions, of Brazil T20, all the summits. I said all the volumes, all the just to show that this is what T20 actually does, and look at how beautiful this looks, the setup, the organization of the conversations, and so on, the value that you actually are able to extract from all of these policy, all of these thinkers, researchers coming together to try and offer the world some solutions to these problems. But he simply said to me that, look, Chief, we are currently involved in the development working group, or a working group of the finance track. We've never heard of Think 20. We don't know what you guys do. But if you go to any website of the G20, what does it say about Think 20? It says that the Think 20 is the brains, is the ideas bank of the G20.
I heard once something that we Brazilians don't say, but I like it a lot. That is not only being invited to the dinner, it's defining the menu.
Yeah.
So defining the menu means that you define what is going to be served, how it's going to be served, and for who it is going to be served.
Yeah.
And we are being invited for a lot of dinners.
Yeah.
We're not being invited to define the menu, defining what is the things that are being produced and served in this process. And I think one of the questions said that we don't want a new imperialist country to define what we want.
Yeah.
We want to produce together. You want to define together what's this new narrative about development. Yeah. What means development is not only economic development. There's a lot of dimensions of development in this process. And for this, we have to really listen to ourselves, and not only think tanks, but the think tanks' interaction with their own society, the think tanks' interaction with communities, the think tanks' interaction with local governments. Yeah. And this is also them understanding the role of think tanks. And there is one discussion that is quite important. What means evidence? Yeah. What kind of evidence are bringing to debate? What kind of research are bringing to the debate? What kind of knowledge translation we are bringing to the debate? And when we bring the Southern perspective, even this change, because we're saying we are producing evidence, we are not just corroborating the evidence that you are producing, we are translating the knowledge in our cultural aspects, in our cultural language, and in our own interpretation of this. And then we have to establish a dialogue, effective dialogue. And that it's not for the global South and North dialogue. It's even through the global South in itself. Because there are difference of power, difference of inception, difference of cultures. So one of the things that I think this process from T20 to Southern Voice to BRICS and others bring is that we start to understand a little bit more what are the mind gaps, what are the knowledge gaps that we have, what are the cultural difference, respecting this difference, but establishing effective dialogue. Is a process, and it's a process that has some waves of good and production of dialogues and some waves that are not that good. So you have difficulties. I think for us, we are coming from India and handing over for South Africa was amazing. For you, we were coming from Brazil and handing over for a completely different process that might be not that participatory. And one of the things I think is quite important is that you don't let ourselves dominate by this fear of what's coming, but how we can produce from what we learn. What processes do you want to maintain? Because we learn to dialogue. We learn to establish spaces. And if it's not possible to establish a dialogue in the same ground basis with the new G20 presidents or the coming G20 presidents, we should not be afraid of maintaining our dialogue. So Southern Voice platform is one of the spaces for this. And it's important, the process of dialoguing, even with the Northern institutions that are not afraid of what Southern countries are bringing to the table, are defining the menu. And that's quite important in the process of what is this structure that is established and that cannot be a house of cards that's just will dismantle if a new power comes. So how, in your perspective, could you maintain this dialogue from T20 to Southern Voice, even though the process is not favorable as the past ones?
Said, that we have the level of uncertainty about next year's T20. Currently, as it stands, we don't know, who we're going to hand over to. So at least in the meantime, what we're going to do is hand over to an embassy. So that should they decide at whatever point, they at least have, the handover files and so on. And we hope, of course, that, they will continue, with these channels, for dialogue, and so on. But you're right, that doesn't stop, that doesn't have to stop, the Global South, from continuing, to raise, these issues. It can never stop. Luciana, we can never stop, to do that. Our platforms such as, Southern Voice are absolutely crucial. One of the ways, that, would be important in sustaining these narratives is collaborative work. Right? So fine, we have, we gather, we discuss, we share ideas, we reach even consensus, on the many issues that need to be done, on what the problems are. But we need to also develop, the partnerships to actually do the work together. Because that then helps, to sustain, these narratives, and society, global society observes this. They will see that, so and so and so and so, from country A, country B are working together, and this is what they're producing. We spoke earlier at this conference about the issues surrounding publication, and the representativity, of the publication space, how Global South, knowledge, isn't quite, as represented, as it actually should be, for instance. But here's an opportunity. I mean, if you can imagine, Asians, Africans, South Americans, small island states, researchers from all of these spaces, coming together and producing knowledge for the consumption of the global population. That would be absolutely fantastic. I mean, I heard earlier an important, point that was made. I think it was yesterday, where, for example, someone was referring to, Africa, the whole, narrative about African solutions for African problems, but said, no. How about, African solutions for global problems? Issues of this nature, for example, maybe to help, start, expanding on the narrative, to get, the world to start realizing that the Global South has a lot more to offer, than just, regional, localized, issues, particularly issues of poverty, inequality, that the Global South actually can, offer, solutions for even a lot more advanced, challenges, and so on that, developed economies also face. But we can't do that in silos. I feel, I think it's important that as much as we and our issues are similar, in the Global South, and we can use that, we can leverage that, at platforms such as Southern Voice, conferences, BRICS, academic forum, and others, the T20s, of this world. If you from the Global South come together, build actual tangible, research, collaborative, partnerships, produce knowledge, and then disseminate knowledge. That's how we can effect, seal the narrative, and sustain it and make it even stronger, I think.
And maybe there's something new, different, very interesting, that can be innovative. We hand over for the embassy, but we hand over for ourselves. We have a lot of knowledge produced. We have a lot of dialogues produced. So you can have what I call a T20 innovative process, even though we don't have an institution to hand over, but we have ourselves in its process of construction. And we have a lot of platforms that can use this knowledge for effective communication, effective dialogue, because this translation of the process that you said, how will in fact establish a dissemination and communication process that brings this dialogue for our national process, for our regionals, and our global process. Well, Mika, we met each other for the first time, I think, in India, and then your amazing work in T20 Brazil and T20 South Africa. I think we have a partnership with IGD for sure, and also through Southern Voice. And what one says that real partnership is trust, is built up upon horizontality, and I think we are building this, and we're continuing to build this. And I hope that this process of the Global South that is coming to stay is not something that is going away. It can be even stronger and defined in the new model of development for the world.
And that's it for The Compass. It's been an incredible journey learning about narrative power and how our network is working to transform it. Thank you for joining us for this first edition of The Compass, Voices from the Global South. And stay tuned for more conversations from our network.